This is The Process Shot. I'm Michael. I'm stuck in a haunted movie theater, and I've seen Amsterdam, a newish mystery comedy drama from director David O. Russell. It follows three friends, Bert, Harold, and Valerie, who had met while in hospital during the First World War, moving to Amsterdam and living together until Bert and Harold moved back home to New York. Years later, in the 1930s, Bert and Harold are asked to perform an autopsy on their former commander in the war by his daughter, who believes he was murdered. When their findings confirm this, an attempt to meet her again results in her own death, and their being blamed for it. Attempting to clear their names, they fall into a widespread conspiracy involving elite businessmen, war veterans, Hitler, sterilization, and more. But also a surprise in the return of Valerie, who is entirely eager to help her friends uncover the truth if it means her own freedom of a sort. That first bit about the three of them being friends is important because a solid chunk of the film watches this play out in a lengthy flashback sequence. With how long it goes on developing their backstory, it honestly could have been its own standalone movie, which would have been fine since this part of the film is the bulk of the development for the three friends. The story being told here is worthwhile, given how much of it informs later developments, but it's also complete enough in its structure that it feels like it should have been its own story separate from the rest of the film, which ends up being much weaker by comparison, both in its greater plot structure and in the actual story and how it plays out. The mystery narrative takes a back seat in favor of more character-driven scenes and individual developments, taking away from the ongoing through line, which thus becomes harder to comprehend as new information is shared without a natural flow. Perhaps worse, the mystery story escalates its stakes at a pretty bumpy rate, leveling out for a while before dumping a whole new load of information, then repeating this up until a rather unsatisfying conclusion. All that's left over is the characters, or rather the casting choices, since this movie seems to be made more upon the concept of being an ensemble film than something truly character-focused. Granted, we do get a handful of good performances, most of all Christian Bale as Bert, but overall it's a pretty underwhelming lineup. I'd chalk it up mostly to the story and writing though, which further seems to lean into an odd and unfortunate blend between 1930s mannerisms and modern-day cadence. It's a bit hard to explain, but it makes sense. Sort of. Anyways, that's about half of the movie's problems. The other half is, well, just about everything else. Granted, on the surface, the movie is far from a complete mess, with a very well-handled production that effectively replicates 1930s New York rather faithfully, from the set pieces to the costumes. It's more in how the movie makes use of it all that it starts to fumble. There is a sense of creative stylization within the film, mostly in its direction of performances and line deliveries, as well as some other choices made in sound design and editing, but it's not really consistent throughout the movie, nor does it actually strike me as necessary. Some of these do work, but they still feel out of place because they only ever show up once, and the bits of style that don't work only stand out more. In the end, it feels almost like the movie is trying harder to be stylistic than it needs to be, and failing. Like the filmmakers wanted to test the waters in whatever ways they thought would work, but could never settle on a single idea. Even if they had, though, I don't think it would have saved the movie from its other flaws, which could have more easily been softened if it had just broken up the movie into two separate films, one set in Amsterdam and the other being this 1930s mystery. as doing so would have let both stories breathe and develop more naturally. At the very least, the movie would have actually been set in Amsterdam for almost the entire runtime instead of half an hour at most. Amsterdam. David O. Russell, 2022. 1.5 stars. I wouldn't recommend seeing it. That's it for this review. If you liked it, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel for more reviews. This feels like an inverse from last week, where I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of this movie in this review, but it's mostly because I don't really want to talk about this at length. It's that kind of cinematic pain, I guess.